Welcome to Conversations, a space for sacred dialogue, honest reflection, and deep listening. I'm your host, Kyndra Frazier. Conversations was born from my own inner dialogue, my journey of spirituality through life's unfolding questions and becoming. Along the way, I discovered something essential that transformation often happens not in isolation, but in conversation. In this podcast, I sit with people from diverse faith traditions, spiritual paths, and lived experiences to explore one central question. What does devotion mean to you, and how does your relationship to the sacred shape your life? My hope is that each conversation becomes a light post for those who feel challenged, disconnected, or searching for belonging, and that through our shared reflections, you might find courage, clarity, and a deeper connection to yourself. Wherever you are on your journey, you are absolutely welcome here. Our first conversation, I am super excited about and honored to have this really good human present. It is with none other than Reverend Dr. Luther Smith, Professor Emeritus of Church and Community at Kyndra School of Theology of Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He writes and speaks extensively on issues of church and society, congregational renewal, meanings and dynamics of community, interfaith cooperation, Christian spirituality, and the thought of Howard Thurman. He is the author of Howard Thurman, The Mystic as Prophet, Intimacy and Mission, Intentional Community as Crucible for Radical Discipleship, and editor of Howard Thurman Essential Writings. He is the senior advisory editor for the 5-volume The Papers of Howard Thurman, which is the second largest papers project on an African American. His latest book is Hope is Here: Spiritual Practices for Pursuing Justice and Beloved Community. Luther has received many awards for his scholarship, teaching, and community service. He is a founder of the Interfaith Children's Movement in Georgia that educates, mobilizes, and networks faith communities in being advocates for all children. Let's welcome our first guest, Dr. Luther Smith. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Kyndra, and welcome to you to this new venture of yours. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for your yes. It was such a treat to be able to sit in your classroom when you were teaching at Emory. Being in the Howard Thurman course was like going to church. And as you know, Howard Thurman is one of the greatest Christian mystics for me on the planet, which I believe is why you've dedicated your life's work, part of it, to highlighting his thought. And because of that, I believe, and I think you might resonate with the identity as mystic. Would that be accurate, Dr. Smith?
I do, even though very much like Thurman, you won't hear me self-characterizing in that way. Mysticism means so much to people in very different ways. And so when it comes to, in some way, endeavoring to characterize my own convictions, it resonates, yes, with mysticism, but especially a sense in being a seeker, and how I believe at the very heart of my Christian faith is this understanding of what it means to be a seeker, and especially in terms of beloved community.
Thank you so much for naming the variation of mysticism definitions that are present. And I love how you anchor it in seeking. What were some of your earliest moments of seeking as a child that led you to this moment, that led you to who you are now?
Well, I can remember even at the early age of 5, being very committed to having an outcome in the presidential election
Mm.
for a candidate that was going to be responsive to the plight of Black people. And I'm sensitive about that at the age of 5 because my family would talk at the dinner table about what was happening in the news. When we would go and visit people, the conversations were often about what was happening in the nation, as well as what was happening locally. And I really felt formed in this whole way by which uh, my current situation and my future was being dramatized on a national stage as well as local stages in ways that it really seemed to me this is something that I am paying attention to. And then to have an election in which I could hear persons talking about which candidate is likely to be most responsive to the plight of Black people. All of that was so influential in my life. And the outcome of politics has continued to be something I've not just been aware of, but deeply convicted about as that which we need to be engaged in terms of our spiritual journey, that we cannot divorce what is happening politically from who we are called to be in this world. And from then on, the whole significance of community was also reinforced for me by my local church, in which we had pastoral leadership that was very community oriented, and the messages were very community oriented. So I'm deeply indebted to this second family.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Smith. I value listening, and you were listening really closely at 5 years old, sitting at the table with your parents and with family in terms of what was happening around you. And I really value how listening to what's happening around you, as well as being cultivated in community, has supported you in becoming who you are. What role has listening played in your vocation?
Well, um, it's first the awareness of my own listening to the kinds of messages which I've just shared regarding the plight of an oppressed people, and listening to how my parents would talk about it and others. It was key to me that this was fundamental to my identity as well as to the world in which I was living. Um, and it was a message in which my parents were not endeavoring to instill fear as much as awareness. And I just am deeply indebted to that. And it was a message that wasn't in somehow placed upon me as a kind of force in their effort to shape me in this particular way. They they created an atmosphere in which I felt uh, this is important. And this is important for them to be speaking about in the presence of a child in ways that I felt involved. It wasn't the sort of conversation that was held someplace else where I didn't exist. And we could have all kinds of conversations, but to know that this was integrated into a loving home, um, at the table, which is always the context of intimacy where the heart deepens and thrives. Um, and with the kinds of conversations they would be having with friends as well as with other church members, I was aware of how it was crucial to know this larger environment in which I was living. To have at a very early age be in a downtown department store. I grew up in St. Louis, and to
Mm,
say to my mother, those hot dogs really smell good. Let's get some. And to have my mother say, we can't.
mm,
This is this is not something that the store will allow us to have. And my mother, decades later, talked about how painful it was for her to have to try to explain to me why we couldn't get a hot dog in a department store where we would
mm,
often be shopping, because it was usually the only place where there were items you were looking for were really available.
mm,
So and then there are other kinds of instances along the way where I became aware of there were boundaries I was not to cross, from the larger society, as
mm,
well as the boundaries that African Americans were not to cross.
mhm,
And the injustice of that was so evident, as well as the inspiring witness of Dr. King and so many others, that I was both aware of the reality, the oppressive reality, the injustice of that reality, and inspired by witnesses who modeled what it meant to not just protest that reality, but to be deeply, deeply engaged in transforming it.
mhm, mhm. Wow, you dropped so many gems in what you just named, Dr. Smith. I really value that your parents instilled in you awareness, as opposed to fear, particularly as it relates to stepping into being someone that is advocating on behalf of oppressive communities and stepping in to transform the things that often our government puts in place systemically to perpetuate that oppression. There is so much fear happening in our world, fear of each other, fear of people who look different from us or believe different from us. Or think different from us. Recently, I was really struck by the by the contingent of people who were looking on at the Buddhists walking for peace, and were attempting to thwart that procession from happening. The people that I saw, I believe that they identify as Christian. I'm wondering, Dr. Smith, when it comes to there being so much fear in the world, what practices can support us in being more aware of sharing this world with other humans who are also entitled to believe what they believe, how they believe it.
Yes. Well, I think it's crucial for us to um, understand and affirm and give ourselves to the reality of community as being our home, and that we're not just existing in community in order to wait for a time when we are relieved from this experience of living with other persons and with all of the wonders and the conflict and the trials and the tribulations, as well as the times of delight and uncertainty. All of that is has been part of the human experience since its beginning, and will continue to be part of the human experience, I believe. Um, but to accept that community is our home, that it's that which is given to us by God
Mm,
for us and for the future that God dreams for us. And I think the whole biblical narrative from Genesis to Revelation can be interpreted as one in which we are uh, we are aware of God's dream for us in the creative process, where it's not just about the creation of human beings, but of uh, nature and reality itself, this sense in which community is that into which we are in many ways given for survival and for thriving and for matters of meaning and relatedness.
Mm-hmm.
So as you look at the biblical narrative, the sense in which at the very outset, violence becomes a means of addressing some of the deep human emotions of envy and the wanting to be recognized above and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
So Cain kills Abel. And the ways in which, yes, we are eager to pursue even that which in some ways we have been warned against, but there is this need within us to test and to challenge the things that have been told us are out of bounds.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we have lost our innocence in terms of the garden as part of the human journey. And I loved what Howard Thurman has said about the loss of innocence. He says, the only way to return to the garden is by being good, not by being innocent, because none of us can ever be innocent again because of the experiences that we've had, but by being good. And I think the challenge for all of us is to be really giving our lives to what it means to be pursuing that which is the good for us personally, as well as the good for us collectively. That to me is worthy of our lives.
Mm-hmm. It is worthy of our lives. I agree. Pursuing the good within us and in others and in the ways that we practice our spirituality. That is something that requires intentionality. And as you said, that we don't do it in isolation of others, we do that also in community. One thing that has been super helpful and supportive for me is my own connection to ancestral veneration or honoring. That type of community building with a world unseen is, I think, is informative in how we look back on how we can anchor into the good. And I'm thinking about how you honor Howard Thurman, who is such an empowered ancestor now in your work. And I'm wondering, Dr. Smith, how did you get on the journey of looking at the work of Howard Thurman? I love to hear that story.
Oh, thank you. I had graduated from seminary and I was directing a program. It was entitled The Education for Black Urban Ministries at the seminary, Eden Theological Seminary. And I attended a conference of the National Committee of Black Churchmen. It was held in New York, and I understood this as very much connected to my work at the seminary. I had a board, and when the preachers heard that I was proposing to spend money from our budget to attend this conference, but I was uncertain if I should go and Howard Thurman would be a speaker, they said, "Howard Thurman is this? You have to go." And I am so delighted that there were members of my board who had experienced Thurman and who felt it would be really formative for me to have this opportunity to hear him because they had experienced him as someone both inspirational and transformative in their own ministerial life. All of the persons on my board were clergy. And I went there with an image of who this Howard Thurman must be, because we're very much in the midst of a focus on Black theology and its significance in identifying the direction of the church, the direction in theology, as well as just my own experience of Black preachers who had really had renown in the way in which they delivered a message that would be inspiring for an audience. But when I had heard Thurman, it was like 180 degrees from my expectations. His delivery, but also the way in which I experienced Howard Thurman as offering his heart to us. He would begin by the 139th Psalm, and the way he prayed the 139th Psalm, I didn't even recognize it as the 139th Psalm. There was a sense in which he wasn't just reciting it. When you listened to him and saw him, there was a sense in which he was in it. And it created in the room, and it created in me a sense of how a sacred moment, because when anyone exposes their heart to you, it is time to take off your shoes. And I felt the sacredness of this experience of hearing Thurman throughout his address, where there would be matters that he would be speaking to directly in this gathering that was focused on the Black church, where a great deal of the energy had been placed upon how so much of the white church had failed in terms of supporting slavery and failing to support Reconstruction fully, and the way in which Jim Crow has continued to thrive in the midst of the society. And so there was so much of a denunciation of the white church in what was being said. And Thurman came and certainly understood that and recognized that, but he was saying there's more to the Black church than just being in opposition to the kinds of offenses which it has experienced in the larger society. There is for us the necessity to attend to the spiritual formation of a people in light of the other dimensions of what it means to be living in our faith faithfully. And it was, I think, a message that resonated throughout the room, because it was speaking to what our larger social concern is. And Thurman, when he spoke about the role of the Black church in terms of the spiritual life of the church, that too was speaking to the larger social concern. It was speaking to us very personally. It was speaking to our collective need, but it was also speaking to the very involvements that the church itself was engaged in to overcome oppressive laws and practices in the larger society. They are connected. And without, I think, working in a severe way to make that connection, he was just making it by speaking to the importance of us paying attention these dimensions of what it means to be formed in the Christian faith.
Thank you for that. You bring up such a good point in terms of the call that Howard Thurman was inviting people into then was to be aware of how spirituality foundationally informs the world around us, and how do we engage in our Christian faith and the spiritual aspect of it faithfully in order to meet the moment, which I think is where we're at now. In much of the work that I've been doing in my doctoral work, Dr. Smith, and we've talked about this before, I'm really interested in organizational trauma, particularly as it relates to faith-based organizations. And as I've been reading this book called Managing Polarities in Congregations, as well as doing some informal interviews with a faith institution that recently experienced trauma. They had a split. And what I've been finding in those informal interviews is that there is this polarity between spirit and structure. And it is often not balanced well, particularly in this community or in other faith communities that I've been in and been a part of. What do you say? What do you think contributes to that? That imbalance of spiritual practice as well as structure within faith spaces.
Yes, it's the sort of I think challenge that is true for all faith traditions and has been so. It's the sort of challenge that Jesus had in dealing with those who were authorities of the faith, but who at the same time had positions in relationship to the faith that had really divorced them for the kind of compassion that was needed for the poor, the sick, those who had been alienated from community. And they became so devoted to ways of seeing the world and ways of seeing their faith and ways of seeing their status that they were no longer really seeing these realities that are at the very core of God's heart for creation itself, for community. And they really had failed to honor what their own prophets had spoken about what God desires for us. So, Jesus comes speaking about, well, you remember Isaiah and what Isaiah has said about those for whom we should be caring?
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is quoting mostly throughout the scriptures, both from the prophets and the Psalms.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not as if Jesus is divorcing himself from his faith history, his ancestral history, but he's coming as a voice of fulfillment for that history, speaking to what has been in some ways distorted, forgotten. And so I think we really need to pay attention to how easy it is and how pervasive it is for our institutional religious life to be at odds with truly what God is dreaming for us in terms of compassion and justice. I'm speaking to you on a day in which the nation and probably throughout the world there is this celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And what is important to remember is that in addition to those who were there involved in the kinds of work of Dr. King in terms of matters of justice and protest, there were many in the church, not just the white church, but also the black church, who were offended by what Dr. King was doing and who felt he was truly off course in terms of what a religious commitment should be at this point in time, even if they were not supportive of what was happening in the land in terms of race relations.
Mm-hmm.
They did not feel this was what the church itself should be involved in.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we know how easily it is for individuals as well as institutions to in some way ignore or forget the significance of the roots of their faith that are related to compassion and justice, and to not reduce God to their own anxieties of transformation, their own anxieties about how will this be disruptive of the institutional life if we move in this direction? How might it split a congregation? How might we be jeopardizing our financial resources if we decide to be involved in this? How might I, as a religious leader, find myself no longer the religious leader?
Mm.
When these other aspects of anxiety and fear begin to dominate in the way in which we're making decisions about our personal lives and the institutional commitments of our faith, that's where we're in trouble. And this is where it seems to me, you had mentioned early on in the conversation about the various practices that are crucial. It seems to me it's really vital that we embrace the practices that not just remind us, but deepen us in our ability to be faithful, especially in times when it seems as if so much in the environment is conspiring against our
Yes.
faithfulness. So
Yes.
as you would know, Kyndra, one of the first practices is contemplative praying. How
Yes.
are we praying deeply on matters of listening and our discernment about things, not just always feeling like we have the answers if we interpret scripture in a particular way, but discerning things in light of what's going on in society and being engaged? How are we involved in transformation?
Mm.
If you think that immigrants are a threat, how are you relating that to the scriptures that are continually emphasizing the importance of welcoming the
Yes.
stranger from that you don't know, from some other culture, but someone who's outside of your borders? How are you listening to their testimony? How have you welcomed? How have you taken seriously? This is what not only the stranger needs, this is what your own heart needs, because this is what God needs to be occurring. So it's this kind of listening. And I'll just speak to one other practice, that one of prophetic remembering.
Mm.
We already have messengers who are guiding the way for us. And as you know, from Micah 6, God has already told you what you should be, to do justice and
Yes.
love
Of mercy.
kindness, walk
Yes.
humbly with God. So it's not
Mm.
as if we are in some sense bankrupt in terms of messages and insights. This we have, but how are we attentive to it, and what leads us to not pursue it? So a question I continue to struggle with is, how do we, in many ways, read about the prophets in our liturgies, as
Mm.
well read about the prophets in our own Bible study, and then find ourselves with no witness that is prophetic, either in the life of the church or in our lives personally? That if you look at a church and you're asked, what kind of prophetic witness do you have in the community?
Whew.
They can't name anything. How is that sort of inconsistency occurring?
Hmm. Wow. If I had a shoe near, I would throw it at you, Dr. Smith. Uh, this is so good. I really value this thought, not to reduce God to our own limitations, and the invitation to consider contemplative prayer and prophetic remembering as guideposts to support us in our forward movement towards compassion and justice and goodness. I'm so glad that you mentioned that we are pre-recording on MLK Day, and how MLK inspired so much hope in the midst of such clear challenge during that time, that really mirrors where we are at this time. That hope that he instilled reminds me of your book, Hope is Here. Thank you so much for writing this, Dr.
Oh,
Smith.
thank you.
When you hear this title now, hope is here. Given the context that we're in, what does hope mean to you in this moment?
Mm. Well, hope, like many terms, has multiple meanings, just like love has multiple meanings. And for some people, it's primarily around matters of romance or a feeling of attraction or delight in another, care. And that's fine. But there are deeper, deeper meanings of love that with which we struggle, especially the expression of love around matters of forgiveness,
Mm,
especially around matters of like loving our enemies. Um, we don't give a lot of uh,
yeah.
attention or help in understanding how to do that. Even
Hmm.
we say, well, this is what Jesus has said, this is what we should do. But like my experience in my almost 80 years on this earth and deeply involved in the life of the church, I have never had church instruction on how to forgive
Hmm.
or how to love an enemy. I've had the message to forgive and to love, but not how. And this is where we have work to do. So it's important for me to take seriously how hope itself is more than optimism, which is principally the way in which people will look at this question of hope. I I have the hopes that in the next election we'll have outcomes that we want, or the sense in which this child hasn't come right yet, but I just have to believe that in the coming months or years, this child's going to find the right path. That's fine. That's an expression of hope or desire. I have the hope that next year my football team is going to make it to the Super Bowl. We use hope to
Yeah.
express desire. We use it to express a kind of optimism. Um, but there's a deeper meaning to hope that I've been looking at for over some 50 years now. And that is um, the meaning of hope uh, for persons who are in the midst of suffering, for persons who are in the midst of life that is thriving, the meaning of hope that is deeper than just what I desire and feel, deeper than uh, what I'm really anticipating is a possibility to come forth. And that is hope as a force of God that
Mm,
enlivens us to life, as a force of God, just like love is a force of God. That love is more than just how attracted I am to something or what I
hmm.
want, like I love ice cream. Love is deeper than that. And hope is deeper than simply the kind of things to which we aspire or the sorts of ways in which we believe something will intervene and relieve our discomfort. It's it's a force of God that enlivens us to life. And I have been on this quest to perceive in persons who are in the midst of health situations,
Mm,
political situations, where you are not seeing any promise of relief, but who are living witnesses to the power of hope to enliven them to life
mm,
rather than to simply find their life diminished by the realities of their health situation or their social situation or their family situation. And it's where they are not lost to the realities that they are experiencing, that we are experiencing, but they come alive in a different way. So in the midst of personal suffering, there's a way by which people are seeing things that they had not seen when they just had assumed that because they were fully engaged physically, that they were following scripts that the society had for them, or they were following scripts that their family had imposed on them, or they were following scripts that they had imposed on themselves. And they could see a greater fullness to life into which they would be giving themselves in what time they had and what capacities they had. And they have a testimony about this in ways that you come to understand that hope and the work of hope is always available to us because God is always available to us. So it's here. But if you are misreading the presence of God because of whatever's going on, you are misreading the presence of hope. And you're misreading the presence of love. But it's not just a kind of philosophical, intellectual way of moving in that direction. There are witnesses to this truth. And what I pursued was the witnesses, as well as the way in which I would enact in my own life the kind of practices, the kind of searching that would enliven me to the reality and the presence and the transformative power of hope.
Wow. Hope as a force of God that enlivens us into transformation. Wow. In the book, you challenge what you call a domesticated version of hope, which is what you just named. Mm-hmm. How do you see that showing up in social movements today and even spiritual communities?
I think there is too often, as I had mentioned, this sense in which our only hope is to win the next election. Mm-hmm. And I think winning the next election is something, if you really, it's important to give oneself to if you believe the next election holds the promise of transforming the realities that are so oppressive. Our people have lived through election after election where there weren't that many promising options you would be voting for, but they had to come to ways to live creatively and vitally in the midst of ongoing matters of oppression, regardless of the outcome of the next election. And so it's important, I think, to try to work with the various structures and means of transformation, even when they are not going to fully deliver in terms of the kinds of things that we see. But it's also important to be continually forming oneself to have a prophetic character related to our social witness. How am I deepened in this struggle such that I am not overwhelmed by the defeats that are part of any struggle of transformation? I can lament, I can grieve, I can feel the stress. I'm not denying those emotions. Yes, they not only have their day, they deserve their day. Mm-hmm. It's one thing from experiencing an emotion and turning your life over to an emotion in a way that cuts you off from the ongoing prophetic work to which we are called. And that is to pursue this beloved community. And this is why I think the vision of beloved community, what we're able to begin to see increasingly as God has this dream for us, this vision for who we are to be with one another, is essential for us to have for every person, each individual, so that when there's defeat after defeat and we feel crushed by so much, it's the vision that lets us know we are not done. We have that for which to pursue, and there's a wonderful book by Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor,
Mm-hmm.
who, when he describes what it meant to not just survive, but to find purpose, even in the concentration camps, he said the
Mm-hmm.
thing that enabled him and others was a sense of meaning. With a sense of meaning, you can survive. And I don't, when I say survive, I don't mean in terms of not being killed or anything, but your spirit can survive any of the worst that your body is experiencing and that your spirit is experiencing. It can survive that with a sense of meaning, because it's the meaning that keeps you energized and available and responsive beyond the horror. And even if you know that the next day is your day of crucifixion,
Mm.
it's the meaning that enables you to go forth, because your way of responding to that which is a testimony of life.
Mm.
Uh, Dr. King would say, to quote Dr. King again, he'd say, if a person hasn't found something that one's willing to die for, one isn't fit to live. So it's not, so even death is not the cancellation of the depth of this significance of meaning and purpose, and being 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 fully available to life itself as one can, because of a spirit that refuses to be in some way overwhelmed by
Mm.
life circumstances.
Mm. Spirit that refuses to be overwhelmed by life circumstances. Thank you for naming that, Dr. Smith. I'm wondering, given the times that we are in, you mentioned this a bit for the challenge of maintaining that transformative hope that you're naming in the midst of such suffering. How do we, as people of faith, or even as faith leaders and people who are committed to compassion and justice, how do we help people stay with that type of hope when we know that the relieving of suffering is not going to be immediate?
Yes, yes. Well, this is where remembering the ancestors, I think, is vital. That it's not a matter of uh, the work that I'm doing for myself
Mhm.
and for others and in the present, and becoming someone who is so divorced from history, so divorced from the ancestor, a self-imposed kind of divorce, that I'm basically an orphan from the past, and and an orphan that has no connection to my past. But even
Mm.
as an orphan, how do I work myself to discover the roots that are there, that are for me? And for me, it's in the ancestors.
Mm.
When I think of those who have endured slavery, and in the midst of slavery could sing songs of jubilation and God's presence, and uh, the delight in knowing the trouble don't last always, and having a sense in which um, God is with us in the midst of this slavery, and our rejoicing hearts can both grieve this larger circumstance that we're in, and at the same time not be defeated by what is happening
Mm.
to us.
Mhm.
So we see more than what is happening to us. We see it, but we see more than that. There's a bigger picture here of the reality of who cares for us, and that we are worthy of more than we are experiencing in this place and what is happening to us. And for some, it was so powerful as to lead to escape. For some, it was so powerful as to endure, but to endure in terms of sustaining the next generation, whatever that might be. It was for another day. For some, it was in terms of what would happen when we would steal away and have those services that would remind us of who we really are, not just, the way in which we are treated as just property, but who we really are, and how the songs we sing bring forth that which enables us to persist in the midst of this kind of trial. So it's the ancestors who are not just in a distant past for me; they are present.
Yes.
And they are part of the cloud of witnesses
Yeah.
as to how we can be in this day and time without surrendering ourselves to fear and anxiety, being numb, thinking this is the worst of times. We are not living in the worst of times. I've even lived through worse times, and much the ancestors have lived through worse.
Yes.
But when I am dealing with what is current, surrounded by these ancestors, surrounded by the cloud of witnesses, as we find in the book of Hebrews. And Kyndra, one of the things, I have 3 pages of the names of people who have inspired me from all kinds of traditions. Certainly many within the Christian tradition, but others within the Hindu tradition and the Buddhist tradition, the Jewish tradition, persons and their political witness. I keep them here near me because they are part of my cloud of witnesses that remind me that I am moving through this time with them. And in many ways, it's a we thing, not just a me thing. It's a we thing. It's like when Jesus had left the time of baptism and went out in the wilderness, and when these forces kept what we call the temptations of Jesus speaking to him there in the wilderness. And what is Jesus doing? He's quoting from Deuteronomy. He's bringing the past to his ordeal to address what for him is just a very stressful and life jeopardizing ordeal. He brings forth the ancestors to speak to that from Deuteronomy. In some ways, whatever that force was tempting Jesus, it was a minority in terms. This force was not just dealing with Jesus by himself, but it was having to deal with Jesus, who brought a history, who brought a heritage to the point in time of that which was most troubling.
Wow. Whew, you said so much, Dr. Smith. We are on the same wavelength. I do believe that these times are calling for us to not be orphaned from our past and inviting us to get connected to the ancestral witness that you're speaking of. I highlighted Hebrews 12:1 last night in a segment that I'm doing called Lessons in Freedom, talking about exactly what you said, these great cloud of witnesses that aren't in the distant past, but are here in the here and now. And when I think about ancestral remembrance, ancestral veneration, sometimes people will demonize that. the honoring of ancestors on a consistent basis, but it keeps me connected and rooted and grounded and clear that hope is still here and present. You mentioned, which I think is something really powerful, Dr. Smith, that you have this paper beside you that not only includes ancestors from the Christian tradition, but of multiple faith traditions. What
Yes.
about your journey has allowed you to be so open to welcoming people of other faiths?
Oh, thank you. Well, it was something that I really attribute to my household.
Mm,
It's not that my family was deeply engaged with other faith traditions, but their understanding was the importance of seeing all persons as worthy of respect,
mm,
as worthy of sacred meaning, and we could have different ways of perceiving our traditions, different ways of perceiving the world, but what was most crucial was to recognize that we are all children of God.
mm,
We're all children of God.
yes.
And to think otherwise, you can find yourself at times within your own faith tradition at war with others who have so considered you to be outside the bounds of what they believe is true faithfulness that they're ready to do you in. And you know, the Christian history is one of we execute our own, we burn our own, we
Yes.
send our own outside to. So, but then it's important. It was important for me to not just have this sense of recognizing all persons as ones of sacred children of God, but to also come to have an appreciation of how God's truth and wisdom resides even beyond the Christian
Mm,
tradition, and to hear the voices from those traditions of how God has been with them and empowered them, their own self-awareness of that, their own testimony to that,
mm,
and the kinds of ways in which we understand love, for example, as well as the ways in which we understand community. So when when you look at the Christian tradition itself, you can easily begin to question why is this tradition uplifting itself as the only one that
absolutely.
knows what love and truth is about when there are horrors that are in that tradition. And as someone who is devoted to my faith
Mhm,
and who embraces it, one of the things we have to, I think, really work at is how do you remain devoted to something that when the more you know about it, the more, in many ways, it seems to be failing you because it
mhm,
has failed itself.
mm,
And and how do I forgive in that tradition? um, how do I love those who I feel have failed me in terms of how they live the tradition? Now we're getting back to some things we talked about earlier. And it it's important for me to know how to be a Christian without expecting that tradition to have been perfect,
mm.
to have been completely exemplary, which is helpful in knowing also how to love myself. Because
Wow.
I can find within Luther that which is disappointing.
Mhm,
And how, why should I? And then it raises the question, how do I relate to my neighbor? If my neighbor has all kinds of expressions of my neighbor's life that I find fault with. How do I relate to my neighbor in ways that are not always in some stance of judgment and ready to reduce my neighbor to the worst that I've seen in my neighbor? Because there's more. I think as we work at this, what we're really working on is how do we become a people who are able to give themselves to beloved community?
Yes.
Where you don't have to be the same faith orientation I am. You don't have to be the same political party I am. You don't have to be the same race I am. You don't have to be the same ethnicity I am. You don't have to be the same tribe I'm in order for us to have this caring, compassionate relationship with one another. The answers to that will only be clearer as we live them. But to give ourselves to that, as I think God's calling upon us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for these reminders, Dr. Smith, to really stay committed and rooted to creating this beloved community by diving more deeply into our spiritual practice of contemplative prayer, as well as building intentional community and staying curious about our neighbors and not reducing them to their worst behaviors or worse presentations, as we also work to heal the parts of ourselves that we have a hard time seeing because of our own disappointments, and this opportunity for people who may be looking at this and not be not have been open to interfaith dialogue prior to this conversation. I'm so grateful that you named your own journey into becoming welcoming of all people, regardless of what their identities are, because they are children of God, and we all bear the Imago Dei. As we wrap up, I have one last question, Dr. Smith. You've dropped so many gems of wisdom. I want to know what you can leave with folks who may be watching this and feel daunted by this transformative hope that you're speaking of, because they're somewhere where they're really pulled on their circumstances and they are really challenged right now. What's a word that you might give to them in this moment?
I think that I think most of us are formed by experience. It's not just what kind of philosophical approach we have to life, and but how are our experiences shaping us, providing a sense of the way forward in light of what we've experienced in the past, the kinds of prejudices we've experienced, and to what extent are they going to now occupy our hearts completely. We're all dealing with something, and at times the kinds of things with which we're dealing can be characterized as trauma.
Yes.
Which can be even more difficult to move through in terms of that type of experience. So, as you know, I cite in the book, the author, the book on Hope is Here, the author Bessel van der Kolk. His book is The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's my go-to.
He's citing a neuroscientist who has said there is within every person that which experiences trauma but is not overwhelmed by trauma, and works to organize the many dimensions of ourselves for a more creative life. So this is a neuroscientist. In the Quaker tradition, you have the comment regarding the hidden teacher within, the hidden teacher. You get in Thurman and many of the mystics this sense in which the inner self, the authentic self, the true self is at work on our behalf for our wholeness. If this be true, then we all have this capacity to be more than the kinds of travails that are happening to us. But it's not the kind of thing that necessarily occurs out of being passive to what is happening to. And how are we involved in the work that is so important to our own release, fulfillment, ability to see anew, the ability to be on the journey, even if it's not doesn't come to us all at once, but at least to be on a different kind of path, simply being a subject of violation and a subject of despair and a subject of fear. How am I to be so much more than that, because I was created to be so much more than that? And this is where I think the practices are crucial. And I'm not trying to get into any kind of work salvation. I'm not there. But how do I take seriously that I have responsibilities to be involved in that may be disruptive for my life? Remember, I said hope is disruptive. There are all kinds of patterns in my life I may need to change. But what is available for me is available for me. It's not just out there as some kind of a teasing illusion or delusion. It's available for me. And if we're not spiritually lazy, we'll do the work that occurs through deepened prayer, remembering our heritage, the prophetic remembering, the crossing of identity boundaries, and not allowing poor crossings or bad crossings to somehow or another lead us to deciding I'm done with crossing identity boundaries, either my crossing other people's or having them to cross mine. The transforming of conflict. And there's conflict not only against those of us who think alike, there's conflict among us who do think alike. And how we go at one another at times when we both find ourselves, we think we're on the same stage of depression, but because I don't like your strategy, I'm willing to do whatever I can to get you off the stage. And what it means to celebrate community. How do we have our times of gathering where we are there with one another, we're eating together, we're hearing our stories, we may be hearing confessions, we may be hearing remorse, we may be hearing songs that just take us to another place together. We may be seeing the artist depict the vision for us in ways that perhaps we had forgotten. There are all these possibilities that are there for us if we don't get spiritually lazy and think that somehow or another we just got to feel better because we want to feel better. I think Jesus said, "Take my yoke upon you," because and it will bring you rest. But as Clarence Jordan interprets the word rest in Genesis, he says it wasn't because God was tired that God rested. He said a more appropriate understanding of Genesis is that in the seventh day, God zested, not just rested, but zested. And Jesus is telling, take my yoke upon you and I will give you zest. Disciplines are to give us zest. The practices are to give us zest. And that is, I think, not only available, I think it is necessary.
Wow, thank you so much. I have so many other questions that I want to ask after that answer, because the possibilities that you named that we can tap into remind me of the quantum field when we think of neuroscience and all the opportunities that we have to choose to be good, to choose to live in hope, to choose to have a deeper dive into our spiritual disciplines and our prophetic witness. So thank you for being our first guest for Kyndversation, Dr. Smith. I am so grateful for your presence here today.
Thank you so much.